told you that a family once claimed that the house was haunted, not by your typical ghost, but by a talking mongoose, you'd probably think that I was making it up, but I'm not.
Ooh, a story about a fellow talking creature, eh? I can't wait!
This mongoose was both terrifying and fascinating. One minute it was singing and dancing, and keeping you up to date with all the latest village gossip. The next, he was throwing stones at you and threatening to kill you. It's quite possibly the bizarrest haunting in history. A mystery that stumped even the famous psychical researchers Harry Price and Nando Fodor. This is the true story of Jeff the Talking Mongoose. It all started with a strange tapping noise. It was coming from the attic of the Irving family's farmhouse, a farmhouse called Dawlish Cashen, which means Cashen's Gap. It was lonely, isolated, a depressing looking building made up of grey slate slabs and perched halfway up Dalby Mountain on the Isle of Man. Now, this tapping sound was loud enough that the whole Irving family noticed it. James, his wife Margaret, and their 13-year-old daughter, Rory. Just what they needed, a mouse problem on top of all of their other problems. The next day, James took a look in the attic. He wanted to find out just how many furry little critters they were dealing with. Now, he couldn't see any signs of mice, but what he could see was a small Indian wood carving. He picked it up and examined it. It was one of his figures, he recognised it, but how on earth had it gotten up in the attic? I mean, he certainly hadn't put it there. He dropped the figure back onto the attic floor, and the sound was familiar. It was the same sound that they'd heard the night before. Strange, he thought. Anyway, the Irvings then went about their day as usual. There was lots of work to be done on the farm. Later that evening though, the strange tapping sound could be heard again. The three of them stopped what they were doing and listened intently as the noises grew louder and louder. Soon it sounded like there was something running around up there. That is no mouse, James said. And boy was he right, because next, whatever it was started barking, growling, hissing, spitting and blowing. Then a loud crack reverberated throughout the house, shaking the pictures on the walls. And believe it or not, over the next few evenings, things would only get weirder. The animal, or whatever it was, started making gurgling sounds. It sounded like a human baby trying its hardest to form words. Then came a little bark with a pleading note in it. James had been a little bit scared of the creature to start with, especially after that loud cracking sound. But that fear had now turned into curiosity, wonder. What other noises could it make? James started making different animal sounds. Bow wow dog, he said. And to his utter surprise, the creature repeated this back to him. Oh, and not just the animal sound, but the word dog. The creature's voice was shrill and high-pitched, around 1 or 2 octaves higher than the human voice. Meow, cat, he said, and the creature repeated this back too. James tried many different animal sounds and names, and each time the creature repeated them back flawlessly. James, quite understandably, was in awe of the creature, and continued to play this little repetition game with it in the evenings. Soon, James only had to name the particular animal or bird, and instantly, always without error, it gave the correct call. The creature quickly started learning many other words, not just animal names and sounds. So James's daughter Rory thought that it might be quite fun to teach it some nursery rhymes, and the creature absolutely loved this. It happily repeated them back to her, word for word. Its vocabulary was rapidly growing, and would you believe it, in a few weeks' time it was speaking the English language fluently. Now, when the Irvings first moved to this farmhouse, James installed an inner wall of matchboarding to help keep the drafts out, and the creature was clearly using the empty space in between these walls to move around the house unseen. But it could see the Irvings because there were many holes in the walls and the ceiling joints that it could look through. It followed James about, pestering him with questions. Just one more question, it would say, then I'll let you go to bed. It seemed to have an insatiable thirst for knowledge. James continued to teach the creature, and soon it could no longer just be an it. He needed a name. The Irvings decided that he sounded like a Jack, so that was what they would call him.
Wait, I thought he was called Jeff.
I was going to talk about the name change later, but seeing as you brought it up, I might as well talk about it now. You see, about half a year after Jack made his first appearance, so sometime in early 1932, he overheard James and Margaret having a conversation. They were talking about a guy called Jeff. Jack then called out, "I don't like the name Jack, call me Jeff." And so from then on, he was known as Jeff. So I guess I'll start calling him that now too. The Irvings would soon find out that they could hide nothing from Jeff. His hearing was top-notch and he could spy on them through the many peepholes dotted around the house. And Jeff, well, he started to get a little bit mischievous. If James sat up in the middle of the night, Jeff would shout, "Lie down, you devil." He would watch James go to the bathroom and narrate everything that he was doing. And he did the same thing whilst Margaret was undressing to get into bed. One night, James whispered to Margaret, "What in the name of God can he be?" And almost instantly, the words repeated back to him from behind the wall. Jeff had heard his whisper. The Irvings wondered if Jeff might be a ghost, and Jeff confirmed that indeed he was. "I am a ghost in the form of a weasel, and I shall haunt you with weird noises and clanking chains," he said. Then, for added dramatic effect, he added some metallic clanking sounds, which terrified their daughter Vori. She became pale with fear. James was a bit scared too, but he put on a brave front. "All right, you devil," he said, "haunt away. You've come to the right house and the right people." It was seen that Jeff wanted to spook the Irvings into leaving. He banged loudly on the walls and laughed uncontrollably. His laugh was pretty terrifying. It sounded almost satanic. James would feel small stones hitting him and then hear Jeff's shrill voice and laugh. Jeff was throwing things at him. This was worrying. It was small stones now, but what if things escalated? What if Jeff could actually do some real damage? Eventually, Jeff saw sense and he tried to coax the Irvings into being friends with him. Living alongside them might actually be quite nice. They could provide him with food and, most importantly, intelligent conversation. Unfortunately, his attempt at convincing them didn't really go to plan. In fact, it actually sounded like he was threatening them. "If you are kind to me," he said, "I will bring you good luck. If you are not kind, I shall kill all your poultry. I can get them wherever you put them. I'm not evil, but I could be if I wanted. You don't know what damage or harm I could do if I was roused. I could kill you all if I liked, but I won't." James certainly did not like the sound of this and decided that it was time to try and get rid of Jeff. James boarded up the holes in the walls, but Jeff tore the boards away. James armed himself with a shotgun to try and scare Jeff into leaving, but this didn't work either. So next he put some rat poison on a piece of bread and placed it at the top of the staircasing. Jeff, he was smart though. He'd sussed out James's plan and he would have some fun with it. He pretended that he'd fallen prey to the poison, and he squealed and squealed at the top of his lungs, non-stop for a whole 20 minutes. The screams were terrific, as loud or louder than a human being could make. It was then that Jeff would turn his attention to Vori, taking up residence behind the walls in her room and making a terrible racket. The Irvings decided that the best way to keep Vori safe was to move her bed into their own bedroom. Jeff, though, always listening, always watching, was livid at this decision. He was hiding behind the wainscot, and as soon as they began to move her bed, he went ballistic. He screamed, he screeched, he threatened them, and banged his fist against the wall panels. Then, in a voice filled with rage, he shouted, "I'll follow her wherever you move her." The Irvings, undeterred, continued moving Vori's bed into their bedroom. That night, they barricaded their bedroom door with dressing boxes, chairs, and a heavy weight. But Jeff was determined to get in. Irvings watched in horror as the top of the door started bulging in as though some terrific force were thrusting against it. But the door held. They then heard Jeff shriek, "I'm coming in!" A few moments later, a pot of ointment was thrown against the bedstead. After this rather dramatic confrontation, Jeff seemed to calm down, and over the next few weeks he became more friendly towards the Irvings. "Let Vori go back to her room," he said. "I won't harm any of you." Eventually, the Irvings and Jeff realised that really it would be best for everyone if they could all just learn to get along, and so began an unlikely friendship. Jeff and Vori would actually become quite fond of each other. He liked to watch her play, especially when she used to play hide and seek with the family dog Mona. He followed her to school, making sure to stay hidden along the way in the long grass and the bushes. He wanted to keep an eye on her to make sure that nobody caused her any trouble, and if they did, he'd throw stones at them. The Irvings made sure that Jeff was well fed, leaving out lots of food for him to find. He particularly enjoyed biscuits, sweets, chocolate, sausages, and lean bacon.
Chocolate? I thought chocolate was poisonous to most animals.
Yeah, I think you're right, but Jeff isn't just any animal, now is he? How many talking weasels do you know?
Quite a few, actually. It's not as uncommon as you think.
Oh, okay. I'll just have to take your word for it. You're a strange talking creature too. Jeff's favourite hiding place in the house was the top of the boxed-in staircase, located in his favourite person's room, Vori's room. This spot was under the ceiling and could only be seen if you stood on a chair. It became known as his sanctum. He was a really good friend to Vori, providing her with the companionship that she so sorely needed. You see, life at Dawlish Cashen was hard and lonely for the Irvings, even more so because James and Margaret, they weren't really farmers at heart. They were actually from Liverpool City. They were city folk through and through. James had once been a very successful travelling salesman, but and the First World War happened and his business went under. After some other failed business attempts, James decided to use the family's savings to purchase Dawlish Cashen. They moved into it in 1917 with their 2 older children, Gilbert and Elsie.
Wait, you've never mentioned those 2 before.
I know, but there's a reason for that. Sadly, by the time Jeff came into the picture, Margaret and James seemed somewhat estranged from them. Now, purchasing a farm was a pretty odd choice for the Irvings, seeing as neither James nor Margaret had any farming experience. The farmhouse had no modern comforts, no electricity, no telephone, and the isolation, well, that must have certainly been a shock to the system. Being halfway at Dalby Mountain, the nearest village was a half-hour climb away, and only adding to this isolation was the fact that many saw the family as being a bit odd and aloof. They were outsiders. Now, there's no denying that Jeff was annoying, mischievous, and sometimes a little bit mean, but he also helped to ease the family's loneliness, especially Vorry's. He was such a character, and he provided the Irvings with a lot of entertainment. He sang hymns and popular songs like Carolina Moon. Apparently, he could also play a small mouth organ, and he had a little gong that he used to ring. He danced on the top of his sanctum, jumping up and down, making one hell of a racket. He even had a ball that he loved to play with. He bounced it along to tunes that the Irvings played on their gramophone. He went on these little adventures to the nearby villages, where he picked up all of the gossip, and of course, dutifully reported it back to the Irvings. He would also bring back little presents, a paintbrush, some pincers, some gloves. On one of his adventures, he stole someone's sandwiches from a paper bag. They were very upset that their dinner was missing. When Jeff returned home tired from his trips, he would often whisper, "Hey Jim," his nickname for James, "how about some grubbo?" And James would of course comply, leaving out something nice and tasty for him to eat. Jeff was also incredibly full of himself. He would say, "I'm the 5th dimension, I'm the 8th wonder of the world, I can split the atom." And you know what? He was right to be full of himself. He could apparently speak many languages, but eventually developed what seemed like some clairvoyant abilities, and he could even read a little bit too. As I'm sure you've gathered by now, Jeff didn't really like to be seen, and in true dramatic Jeff fashion, he would say, "I'm a freak, I have hands and I have feet, and if you saw me, you would be paralysed, petrified, mummified, turned into a pillar of salt." Sometimes though, he would let the Irvings see his shadow. They would do this by holding up a candle to his sanctum. He definitely wasn't lying about the hands part. He showed the Irvings them through a slit near the ceiling. According to Nandor Fodor's Haunted People, the family was watching from a distant corner, as Jeff demanded. Their fingers were short, yellow, and the nails were curved. Later, Jeff allowed his fingers to be touched. There were 3 on each hand and a thumb. Mrs. Irving was even allowed to stroke his fur and put her finger into Jeff's mouth. Of course, word of Jeff the Talking Weasel spread quickly, first to friends and people in the nearby villages, then to the press. Articles about him began to appear in the papers, and he became known as the Dalby Spook. The Irvings really did not like all of this media attention they were getting, especially because people now started flocking to their farmhouse, hoping to see Jeff in action. A few of these visitors were lucky enough to hear Jeff's voice, and some would even bear witness to his famous penny trick. For this trick, a visitor would be asked to place a coin on a window ledge on the porch. Jeff would then declare whether the coin was showing heads or tails. Sometimes he got it right, sometimes he didn't. Given Jeff's close relationship with Vorry, people started to suspect that she was responsible for the phenomena, that she was a natural ventriloquist playing tricks on the family. The Irvings denied this though. They were 100% sure that Jeff was the real deal. Though Jeff was careful to try and remain hidden from the Irvings, they did manage to catch some glimpses of him outside of the shadows that he allowed them to see. Margaret described him to the press as being a little yellow animal, perhaps a cross between a rat and a weasel or stoat, with a long bushy tail and a flat face like a pig. It was this description that prompted a reader to write to the paper, suggesting that Jeff wasn't in fact a weasel at all, but instead a mongoose. You see, in 1912, a farmer had imported a whole load of mongooses to the Isle of Man. He hoped they'd help keep the growing rabbit population in check. Perhaps Jeff descended from one of these mongooses.
Actually, I'm pretty sure it's mongoose, not mongooses.
Well, I googled it, and apparently mongooses is the preferred plural form, so there. Jeff agreed with the idea that he was a mongoose. He would say, "I am just an extra clever little mongoose." He elaborated a bit on his origins, telling the Irvings that it was actually a marsh mongoose born in Delhi in India in 1852. He came to the Isle of Man via Egypt, but how exactly, he didn't say. Just like the mongooses introduced to the island all of those years ago, Jeff also helped to keep the rabbit population in check. He often killed rabbits for the Irvings. Sounds a bit grim, I know, but it was actually his way of repaying their kindness. You see, the rabbits could be sold in the village for a pretty penny. He'd call out "Got a rabbit" and leave it outside their front porch. It was in February 1932 that the renowned psychical researcher Harry Price would learn about Jeff. Importantly, he didn't learn about Jeff from James, but from a lady called Florence Milburn. She wrote to him about an animal which, after a little bit of coaxing, had developed the power of speech and was practically human except in form. At the time though, Harry was busy with another case, so he sent a representative of the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, Captain Dennis, to investigate. Now, in some sources, the name of the investigator is Captain MacDonald or Captain X. Apparently these were fake names used for privacy reasons. Captain Dennis would visit the Irvings 3 times in total. His first 2 visits were intriguing but slightly lacklustre. His 3rd visit though, in October 1935, well, that would be the most eventful and the one most worth recounting. Dennis arrived at the farmhouse at around 5:30pm, but it wasn't until 11pm that things would start to get exciting. Florrie had headed up to bed, and about half an hour later there was a loud knock. "Is that you, Jeff?" James called out. Jeff didn't respond. "Come on, Jeff, if you won't talk, make a noise," Dennis shouted. And boy did Jeff comply. Knocking sounds could be heard all over the house, in one room and in the next, all in quick succession. Then there were 2 violent bangs on Rory's bedroom door. "Go and look," Jeff shrieked. He sounded very excited. Captain Dennis and the others rushed upstairs, where they found that Rory's bedroom door had been locked from the outside. Now, Captain Dennis did a little bit of investigating. He found that the lock could only be operated from the outside, not the inside. So Rory couldn't have locked it herself, and wouldn't be able to unlock it herself. They then went back down to the kitchen again, leaving Rory locked in her room. As they sat by the kitchen fire, Jeff had put on one hell of a show. He shrieked to the top of his lungs, and once again, banging could be heard all over the house. It was coming from the roof, then the stairs, then from the bedrooms. It was as though Jeff could move with lightning speed. This banging continued for 15 minutes, and then there was a very loud crash. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen upstairs. So of course, they all went back upstairs to investigate. They unlocked Rory's bedroom door and went inside. She was still in bed, but awake. They found that a heavy chair, which usually sat on top of Jeff's sanctum, had been pushed over and was now resting partly on her bed, partly on the dresser. Rory didn't seem fussed by what was going on. It was like she was used to it. "Oh, it's only some more of Jeff's tricks," she said. They exited her room and Captain Dennis locked the door again before they all headed back downstairs. From the kitchen, they could hear Jeff's shrill voice getting louder. Dennis asked if Jeff would come closer, and Jeff replied, "Listen, I will imitate a steam whistle," which he did beautifully. Dennis then called out, "Jeff, wait a minute, and I will time you doing the whistle." Jeff imitated the steam whistle once more, whilst Dennis timed him. Jeff held the note for a whole 22 seconds. "Jeff, that's enough of the whistle. Now come down close to us here, as I'm tired of shouting at you," Dennis called out. Moments later, Jeff began to make his way down the stairs, banging on the staircase matchboarding as he went. So violent was his banging that the pictures hanging on the panelling shook and nearly fell off their hooks. Dennis, listening from the open kitchen door at the bottom of the stairs, was absolutely loving this. "That's splendid, Jeff! Knock the blinking house down," he shouted. Jeff let out one of his satanic-sounding laughs. He was really enjoying all of the encouragement. The banging was coming closer and closer. "Hello, everybody!" Jeff shrieked. Dennis was waiting with bated breath. Would he finally catch a glimpse of Jeff? He couldn't wait any longer. The excitement was just too much. He rushed out of the kitchen, aiming his flashlight up the stairs. There was nothing there. Jeff had made a run for it and was furious with Dennis. "You damn sleech!" Jeff screamed. Then there was a loud bang. Apparently, Jeff had forgotten that Rory's door was locked and he'd slammed into it. He had to quickly jump into James and Margaret's room. It was a close call, but he'd managed to remain unseen. At 3 a.m, Captain Dennis decided that it was probably time to call it a night. "Go and vanish, Jeff," he said. And Jeff, still angry with him, replied, "I mean to throw a brick at you tonight when you were asleep. I'll throw pebbles now out the window." The rattle of small stones hitting the window could then be heard.
That was amazing! I love Jeff. He's so dramatic, so mischievous.
He is, isn't he? Kind of reminds me of a little gargoyle I know.
Oh, stop, you're making me blush.
James Irving was in constant communication with Harry Price and Captain Dennis, writing them letter after letter, making sure that they were up to date with all that Jeff was getting up to. In March 1935, Jeff told Margaret, "Look in the ornament on the mantel shelf and you will see something frail." Margaret took a look and found that it contained some strands of Jeff's fur. He'd apparently plucked the fur himself from his own back and tail. This was great. Finally, some concrete evidence that they could give to Harry and Captain Dennis. They sent the fur off to them and Harry would get the samples analysed by an expert. A few days later and the results were in. Unfortunately, the fur was likely from a longish-haired dog or dogs. The hair hadn't been plucked out either. It had been cut, perhaps Jeff had been playing a trick on them all. In June 1935, Harry Price wrote to the Irvings, asking if he could come and visit them. You see, he wanted to investigate the phenomena himself. He'd bring an impartial witness with him too, Richard Lambert, editor of The Listener for the BBC. The Irvings wrote back that they'd be happy for them to come and visit, but unfortunately, Jeff was nowhere to be found. He disappeared the very day that they received Harry's letter. I mean, it was to be expected, really. Jeff could read, and he probably saw the letter. He knew all about Harry, and he seemed quite scared of him. Jeff would say, I like Captain Dennis, but not Harry Price. He's the man who puts the kibosh on spirits. Harry Price was a doubter, and Jeff, well, he didn't like doubters. Anyway, despite Jeff's absence, Harry and Richard went ahead with their visit in July 1935. They hoped that Jeff would change his mind and make an appearance, but sadly he didn't. Margaret Irving gave an impassioned speech, imploring Jeff to show himself, but it was met with silence. The visit, it wasn't in vain though. Harry and Richard actually learned quite a lot. James recounted the whole Jeff affair to them, and the story agreed with all the letters that they'd received, which was a good start at least. They were given a tour of the house and shown Jeff's sanctum. Very interestingly, they noticed that because of all of that matchboarding, the house was like a vast speaking tube with panels like drumheads. As their investigation went on, they found that James always seemed to dominate the conversation and that Rory wasn't really speaking much. So they tried to speak to her without her father present to try and get her side of the story, but they didn't really succeed at this. You see, James, quite understandably, was very protective of his daughter and he wouldn't leave them alone with her. What they did gather though was that Jeff and Rory had started to grow apart. She told them that he is a nuisance. Jeff had made her life really difficult. She was picked on at school and the other children called her the spook. Without Jeff making an appearance for them, Harry and Richard had gotten pretty much all they could from their visit. Before they left though, they gifted Rory a shiny new camera in the hopes that maybe she'd be able to take a photo of Jeff. And they made sure to take some fur samples from the family dog Mona. Maybe Jeff had tried to pass off her fur as his own. Of course, Jeff, the mischievous little thing that he was, returned home that same evening that Harry and Richard left. Well, I've come back, he called out. The Irvings were furious with him for letting everyone down. Nobody wants you here, you should have stayed away, Margaret snapped at him. Following Harry's visit, Rory sent him some pictures of Jeff that she'd taken with the new camera. Sadly, she wasn't used to using a camera, and the photos are not great. People say that these ones sort of look like a fur fox doll, and that these ones kind of look like a rock. And I have to say that I kind of agree with them. James would also write to Harry requesting that he send some plasticine. You see, Jeff had agreed to make some impressions of his paws. Harry, of course, obliged, and so James set about collecting Jeff's prints. He softened the plasticine with some Vaseline as it was quite hard to begin with, and left it out on Jeff's sanctum overnight. The next morning, there was an imprint of Jeff's back paw. They repeated the process twice more and got imprints of his front paw and some of his teeth. These were all sent to Harry, who then had them analysed. Now, Harry Price wasn't the only famous psychical researcher that was interested in Jeff. Nandor Fodor would also get involved. He was a researcher from the International Institute for Psychical Research, and he came to stay with the Irvings for a week in February 1937. He interviewed loads of witnesses that had encountered Jeff, but sadly, Jeff didn't make an appearance for him. By this point, Jeff's adventures away from the farmhouse were getting longer, and the Irvings were seeing less and less of him. He'd even started telling them, "I'm not coming back, mark my words." By 1939, he was hardly seen at all. Rory was now all grown up and had left home to work as a machinist. Perhaps this was why Jeff was not coming to visit as much, or perhaps it was because James had become ill. Sadly, after a long period of declining health, James would die in 1945 at the age of 72, and shortly after, Dawlish Cashen was sold off very cheaply. So what happened to Jeff? Well, in 1947, an article was published in the papers with the headline, "Talking Mongoose Killed," in which the latest owner of the farm claimed to have slain Jeff. Rory, though, was adamant that that creature in the article was definitely not Jeff, so perhaps he's still wandering the island, stealing people's sandwiches. So what really happened here? Was Jeff real, or was it all an elaborate hoax? Well, there was definitely something fishy going on. The fur samples that Jeff provided were found to be identical to the fur that Harry took from Mona the sheepdog. The paw prints were suspect too. The Zoological Society analysed them and apparently didn't think that there were footprints at all. There was too large of a disparity in the size of the front paw and the back paws for them to be from any known mammal, and they were too smooth, there was no signs of any skin texture. The photos of Jeff were also not very convincing either. So maybe it was a hoax, but the motive of this is unclear. It had a negative impact on the value of the Irvings' property, and they certainly disliked all of this attention that they were getting. It wasn't even James that told Harry Price about Jeff. What's more, he had turned down a deal from an American theatrical agent of $50,000 for exclusive rights over Jeff. If it wasn't James, then maybe Rory and Margaret were behind it all. Perhaps they were trying to scare James enough to sell up the farm so that they could live somewhere less awful. I mean, I don't know about you, but I definitely would not want to live there. If this was their plan though, it certainly backfired. Rory, many years later, was still adamant that it wasn't a hoax, that she wasn't a ventriloquist, and highlighted that Jeff was actually very detrimental to her life. Harry Price suggested that the family were victims of some kind of hallucination, brought on by loneliness and isolation. And Nando Fodor suggested that Jeff could have been a split-off part of James's personality to help him deal with the mental starvation of isolated life on the farm. Some suggest that Jeff was a poltergeist, and others that he really was just an extra clever little mongoose. Let me know down in the comments what you think was going on. If you got something from this video, Gagi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, make sure to keep an eye out for Jeff next time you're on the Isle of Man, and if you have, a magnificent day.